Time check. We're going to give it another 60 seconds, shall we? I'm sure the masses are going to start flowing in any time now. So I hope you all found the water that Michael and I were still able to organize. I know, maybe. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this side event. A few days before the end of COP28, my name is Matthias Duwe. I'm head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, a Berlin-based research organization. And this event is hosted in collaboration with our partners from Wise Europa in Poland and CE Delft in the Netherlands. And we are all three partners in a European-funded research project that's called 4i Traction. And we want to use this opportunity today to share some of the research work that we've been doing and insights from that as an input for a conversation. And before I get to further specifics, I want to give you a little bit of background on the project and what the mission is that we've set out to solve. First of all, I want to acknowledge the fact that there is a larger group of organizations that are contributing to this work. We have a colleague here from the Institute for Climate Economics, I4CE in Paris, but one of our partners. There's Climate Analytics, the University of Eastern Finland, the University of Wageningen. We have colleagues in Spain and also in Brussels, the Free University of Brussels, that we collaborate with under this project, and we kindly acknowledge with appreciation the funding that we've received to be able to carry out this work. Now, the challenge that we face globally, but that we in the EU are faced with in terms of advancing climate action is figuring out how we're managing that challenge to achieve climate neutrality by the middle of the century, and the fact that it requires transformative change across, essentially all sectors of the economy, and requires change in the way that we do a lot of normal things like move, eat, heat, power our environment. And what the task for 4i Traction is to do research that is tasked to arrive at recommendations for how the EU climate policy mix can be improved to ensure that we get on a path towards climate neutrality and become and manage that transformation. So transformative policy is what we're setting out to assess and to make recommendations for. We're doing that through the lens of not the traditional sectoral perspectives, but 4 cross-cutting themes, our 4 I's. They are innovation and integration and investment and infrastructure. And we've been analyzing past policies to learn the lessons from the experiences thus far. We have also projected scenarios for policies into the future. And as part of that exercise, we have identified some key instruments that could make a difference, a real difference, that are currently underutilized in getting us to climate neutrality. And so these 3 instruments which have some potential to be really transformative and help get us on that path to climate neutrality is what we want to talk about today. We have these 3 case studies here that all you are going to hear brief introductions to at the start. They are integrated infrastructure planning with a focus on integration and long-term planning. Then we have also public procurement, but public procurement that is geared towards climate neutrality. And we have mandatory transition plans for banks as another tool. So you see the connections to, well, the infrastructure is the obvious one, investments in terms of access to finance. And so our sense is that these three instruments can all play different roles, but all contribute to influencing decisions about investments in our climate neutral future. And that they can be complementary and supplemental to the existing policy signals that we already have in Europe, for example, from carbon pricing, from certain standards and from innovation funding, but that they can help, on the one hand, deliver access to finance, specifically for climate neutral aligned projects, that they can also help provide the resources needed for production processes, for the change that we need to see, and then also create some lead markets for these through public procurement. So I'm excited to have three colleagues that are going to present the inputs on the three case studies here. The first one of these is joining us remotely. The other two are here in the room. And after those three presentations, we're going to have two panelists that I'm going to pepper with questions to see what they feel about the potential of those three instruments from their respective perspectives. One being the global cement industry, and one being a scholar on policy instruments with a quite global perspective. And so I will introduce them as it becomes the term, but I want to start now with our three speakers from the project. And the first one who's joining online is Nina Voulis, who is a senior consultant at CE Delft, working in the field of sustainable energy and systems integration. And then there's my dear colleague Jonathan Gardiner, who is a researcher at Ecologic Institute, working on economic instruments, on carbon removals and climate finance. And then we have Claire Eschalier, who is the team lead for development finance at I4CE, and also the head of the secretariat of the initiative that is called Mainstreaming Climate and Financial Institutions. So Nina, we can see you in the distance. I can see you on screen. Thank you so much for joining us remotely. You are the first to provide an input on the three case studies. We cannot hear her yet. Nina, we cannot hear you yet. My apologies. Well, here's looking at you, tech support. So, is she able to hear us right now?
Yes, Nina can hear us.
Okay. She signaled? Okay, thanks. Hi, Nina. Sorry about that. Keep talking. It may work in any second now. Et voila. Yes. Keep talking. Keep talking. Okay. What I would recommend then is that we maybe change the order very briefly. Yeah? Okay. That is a real bummer. Okay, good. Then
now I can see the slides and the panelists.
Shall we give it a go? Yeah. Okay, good. Nina, thank you. Your turn.
Oh, now it changed back to my own face. Now I see the slides. All right. Great, thank you very much. My presentation on integrated infrastructure planning. I can hear a lot of feedback from myself. Try again on integrate. All right. let's try this one last time. My presentation is on integrated infrastructure planning. I think you all heard that my name is Nina Voulis, I work at CE Delft. And why is integrated infrastructure planning so important is because infrastructure is the backbone of our energy system. Infrastructure, maybe it's a very dry concept or topic, but it's actually the cables, the pipes, those are the bones of our energy system. So they are vital to our energy system. And in the future, more and more electricity and hydrogen will be the energy carriers of a carbon-free system. And so replace fossil fuels, gas, oil, and therefore we need the energy system to evolve to be able to carry those new or expanding energy carriers, and that requires an evolution of the infrastructure. Can you go to the next slide? This infrastructure, it's not something easy or quick to do. No, it is expensive and takes a long time to build. It takes sometimes up to a decade to build a new pipeline or a new high voltage line. Therefore, a long-term integrated view is necessary. Long-term means decades because developing the energy system, the infrastructure takes decades. And integrated means that we need integration across energy carriers, so jointly planning for hydrogen and electricity infrastructure, and also for other energy carriers. And cross-country means transnational infrastructure. And it's that latter, the transnational infrastructure, that we focused on in our work at For Attraction. Next slide, please. So to summarize, integrated infrastructure planning means planning energy infrastructure, there are cables and pipes, for decades ahead and across nations. Next slide, please. Why is it across nations? Why is that so important? Because infrastructure crosses borders of states and of nations. As Matthias said, we did our research in Europe. So on the left side, I have the map of Europe with lots of lines. Those are all the cables interconnecting different regions and countries in Europe. But this is not only European perspective. I have examples, just two examples, of India, where infrastructure crosses states. It's a big country, so states are an important notion. And of South America, where also infrastructure crosses borders. So it's clear that infrastructure, transnational infrastructure, is already important today and will be so much more in the future. Next slide, please. So next question, who is then responsible for planning this transnational infrastructure? Are those market parties and or governments? And are those individual states or nations and or transnational entities? There are different schools of thoughts on roles of markets and governments in general for almost anything in society. There are different schools of thoughts, but for infrastructure planning in particular, most of these schools of thought lean towards government responsibility because of the long-term view of infrastructure planning, because it's a high investment, sometimes high risk investment. So it's something that, and it serves a societal benefit. So it's something that governments are typically more seen as being the right party to be responsible than markets. So the next question is then, governments at state or at transnational level? And that is something that we explored in 3 policy options, and I'll go through them now one by one. Next slide, please. So the 3 policy options are: option 1 was a fragmented state or national governments, option 2 a supranational governance, and option 3 middle of the road. Maybe for you to guess what will be the most the best one. We'll see in 3 slides. Next slide, please. So option 1, fragmented governance, is close to the current situation. We did this research in the EU, so both in the EU, but I think also more globally. Nations in the EU member states are responsible for cross-border infrastructure. That is currently the case. So this is an easy path to continue on. And the other benefit is that the responsibility is local. So it's the local system operators, the national ones, they're close to stakeholders, so that it makes managing stakeholders' interests easier. But it results, this option, in suboptimal and more expensive infrastructure, because there is no guarantee in this system and this policy option that the European or cross-country interests are indeed met. Countries can favor their own interests, which is locally for themselves more important of their interests, of course, but globally, or or EU-wide, this is not necessarily the most optimal or the best solution. So then we have option 2. Next slide, please. It's the complete opposite end, supranational governments. Supranational means above nations, so for instance on an EU level, but this is also possible in other parts of the world. So a supranational entity is responsible for interconnection. This is very far removed, as I said, from the current situation. So that would mean that a supranational entity, a kind of super system operator, would oversee all national costs and benefits of infrastructure and technically and economically optimize the system and interconnection. So they will decide between country A and B, we need this many gigawatt of interconnection, and this is the energy carrier, and so on and so forth. So it is in this policy option easier to reason back from the end state and optimize everything. But this is politically very difficult to implement. It requires significant knowledge transfer, because the knowledge that is now at national level would need to go to this supranational entity. And there is a risk for poor interaction with local stakeholders. So these are significant drawbacks of this solution. And then we have, it's correct, the third option, middle of the road. And this option lies between the first and the second one. So supranationally, there are binding requirements and national implementation. So this means that requirements are set, and that could be either agreed between countries or directed from an EU level, for instance. And these requirements are set, as I said, at a supranational level. So for instance, the EU could say between these and these countries, this is the amount of gigawatts in electric interconnection that we need in this area, and by this time, for instance, by 2035. And then the implementation is at the national level. So the countries have to connect, make this bigger interconnection between themselves. But the specific area, it could be 10 kilometers more to the left or 50 to the right, whatever. And the time scale is also to be decided on a national level. So the benefits of this option is that there is limited limited knowledge transfer required. The responsibility remains local, close to impact and close to the stakeholders that are seeing this infrastructure built in their area. It's possible to implement this in reality, while option 2 was a nice but more theoretical option. There is still some residual risk for fragmentation, less optimal outcomes, but the risk is smaller than in option 1. So that's why this option 3 is the option that will be best for integrated infrastructure planning. Next slide, please. And this is my takeaway message. Infrastructure is the backbone of the energy system. and it needs to evolve to support a carbon-free system, to have more electricity, and we're expecting to see more hydrogen. It means also that transnational infrastructure connecting different countries to carry these energy carriers requires transnational governance, similar to agreements made now on generation. So we're agreeing that, or we're trying, you all are trying to agree, this is how much renewable generation will have each country. So the transnational infrastructure also needs to move into that direction to have a carbon-free energy system. Thank you very much.
And next, indeed, we're going to have Jonathan up speaking to the case study on public procurement for climate neutrality.
Hi, everyone.
Just keep talking.
Thank you for joining us today, both in the room and also online. Today I'm going to speak about public procurement and how it can be used more effectively for achieving climate neutrality. So what is public procurement? Public procurement is the process by which public authorities procure works, goods, or services from companies. And when the authorities are choosing which companies to buy from, it's really important to consider the environmental impacts of the projects. And unfortunately, this currently isn't being done much. You know, the role of environmental considerations in procurement decisions, it has been discussed frequently. You might have heard of green public procurement or sustainable public procurement, but really around the world, application of these standards has been fragmented, inconsistent, and for the most part, voluntary. And in our study, we really found that public procurement could be used much more strategically. And this is why we've introduced the concept of public procurement for climate neutrality. And what this is basically public authorities using procurement to accelerate the decarbonization of specific sectors and goods. And this is done by introducing incentives, for example, in the award criteria, or else introducing requirements for products. So why public procurement? We see a lot of potential in public procurement. For example, it represents around 11% of EU greenhouse gas emissions, 14% of EU GDP. And we carried out an emissions analysis for EU using input-output data. And if you look at the grey segment there, we found that 11% of EU emissions are attributed to public procurement. And these emissions are concentrated in 4 spending areas, so like public administration, defence, human health, construction, education. This represents around 3/4 of public procurement emissions. And this just gives us an indication as to where greening public procurement has the most potential. However, despite these potentials, uptake of public procurement has really been limited. I mean, to give an example, this is the EU, supposed to be a leader in climate change mitigation, and even there, the vast majority of public procurement contracts are decided based on price alone. And the EU has tried to incorporate this with green public procurement, but still application of environmental criteria is still voluntary, and it's not being applied as much as it should be. And for this reason, we see reason to reform public procurement. So what can we do to promote public procurement for climate neutrality? I mean, the first and most obvious is to develop tools and capacity for procuring authorities. So this involves developing methodologies and tools for calculating the environmental impact of projects, building capacity to reduce the administrative burden of public procurement and greening it, Also improving data and monitoring to make it easier to track green public procurement. And the next thing is really making the sustainable option a default, and that means imposing obligations to consider environmental impacts, and also, limiting the use of price only as the award criteria, and encouraging member states to set targets for procurement and report on these regularly and how the targets are being achieved. And the last of these, which we find really the most important, is that is really to implement targeted PPCN rules, public procurement for climate neutrality rules, in sectors that we think have strategic potential. And the rationale for this is that it's very difficult to apply stringent environmental criteria to all procurement categories, and that's why we think it needs to be specific, and also providing these specific incentives to small market categories. It really provides the potential to stimulate the market beyond just the public sector, also encouraging the private sector to follow suit and really drive innovation and investment for low carbon technologies. So which sectors or what criteria would we use to decide which sectors have potential? I think the most obvious would be the sectors that represent the most emissions from public procurement. So this is an analysis carried out by the World Economic Forum, and it shows, for example, defense and security represents quite a large share of emissions, also construction. And another important thing to think about for public procurement is which technologies require deployment support. So which technologies, so where are there alternatives available that are not necessarily cost competitive yet and need policy support to progress and become more widely available across the market. And where we really find this is for basic materials. So if you look at construction, this diagram also shows sector splits. So if you add up other materials, 6%, cement 4%, iron and steel 3%, we see that over half of the emissions coming from the construction sector come from the basic materials within it. And also, the public represents a large share of demand in the construction sector, around 25%, which means through the government's actions, by leading the way in decarbonising and providing a demand signal for these products, we really see strategic potential in terms of what this can do to the wider market for the basic materials. And because of the potential that we see for the construction sector, we really looked at this area in more detail, specifically for steel and cement. And there are really two main options for applying PPCN rules for these basic materials. And the first one is to add incentives into the award criteria that rewards low emissions products. So this could be, for example, having mandatory life cycle assessments before determining which companies to buy the products or works from. This could also be in the shape of mandatory decision weights that are given to the environment when deciding. For example, you could have 50% based on price, 20% based on environment, 20% on quality, and so on. And the other option is to impose technical specifications for key products or sectors, and this would be in sectoral legislation. I mean, in simple terms, this is basically standards that products must fulfill before being able to qualify for a contract. And one example of this is imposing limits on embodied emissions. And both of these options can really be backed up by having mandatory PPCN adoption targets and reporting on how these targets are being met. And these ideas, they're not all completely novel. Like, there are also examples in the United States of the Buy Clean initiative where they're using public procurement to procure steel and cement, and this is also being backed up by the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's really momentum growing for this, and we really see strategic potential in imposing PPCN criteria to drive innovation of these low-emission products. And to conclude, basically what's really important to take away here is that public procurement, by the predictable demand signal that it can provide, it can really help to drive investment and innovation for critical technologies in hard-to-abate sectors and really transform key industries. And thank you very much, and I encourage you to take a look at our report afterwards. There's a QR code you can scan, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the other contributing authors, Mahu, Leon, Benjamin, and Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this very precise and to-the-point presentation. And I think there'll be plenty of things to pick up on in the conversation on the panel. But before we get there, we want to get to the other dimension of the investment eye, not the demand pull, but the access to finance. And Claire presenting us, I don't know where the clicker is, I'm sure you're passing that on now, thank you. The work that indeed was authored by dear expert colleagues of hers on the mandatory transition plans for banks. Claire.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthias, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to present some of the work that my colleague Julie Evin has been working on over the past couple of years. And as I'm sure you'll have guessed, we've talked about integrated infrastructure planning, we've talked about public procurement, and I'm going to try to run you through some of the ideas that we have on transition planning and how they can be an important tool for banks. So as some of you probably know, I think it's been acted already at the European level that transition plans are a useful tool to connect what financial institutions are doing with the real economy and for them to walk the talk of their engagements. And I think at this stage, it's not so much a question about that, but it's rather a question about how do you implement that, and then what do you do once you know that, and knowing that there's still some debates out there, one of them being what is the sectoral coverage that transition plans should have, and the second one being related to the inclusion of transition plans in prudential regulation, so going beyond transparency. I think just before I run you through the report, I just wanted to remind you of some of the key elements of a transition plan. So transition plans are applicable to all listed companies and including financial institutions. And they allow banks in particular to have a clear vision of what they are doing, what they are going to do, and what their clients are doing and going to do to achieve their net zero targets for 2050. Transition plans should set sectoral targets, so the targets should be broken down by sector, but also should set interim targets to be able to be easily implemented. Also, some critical elements on transition plans. To make a good transition plan, you'll need it to be linked with national sectoral pathways, but also try to minimize the use of carbon offsetting in these transition plans. Transition plans need to be comprehensive, cover all sectors, all financial instruments, all technologies, all clients, obviously, but also try to have and to give a clear idea of how the financial institution is going to work with its clients on their own transition plan and engage with its clients. And last but not least, transition plans need to be embedded in the country's strategy from the strategy level and down through the procedures and the KPIs that are ultimately going to be used to monitor the transition plans. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to say a couple of words on who we are, the Institute for Climate Economics. So we're a Paris-based think tank. We provide independent expertise to public decision makers, and when it comes to private finance, we're essentially trying to support them in taking decisions to create a conducive environment. So we essentially talk to supervisors, regulators, central bankers, governments, and try to support them in also walking the talk to create a financial system which can achieve net zero in 2050. So more specifically on the study, which was carried out by my colleague, once again, Julie Evin, I think what is important to note is that the study is in a context of discussions that are taking place at the EU level, but that could also be used or important for the Global South. Discussion how transition plans can also be included in prudential regulations. And this study follows a previous study which had already decided and shown how these transition plans can be useful by being embedded at transition in regulations. And this one looks more specifically at the impacts that transition plans have and can have if you include them in transition regulations. And particularly the impacts that were looked at in this study include the credibility of transition plans, of implementing the commitments that financial institutions have been taking, so at sectoral level, but also on the level of ambition that they have, and also the importance of prudential transition plans in solving some of the internal blockages that banks may have, for instance, not knowing at the internal level how to implement their transition plans. And last but not least, how transition plans can have an impact on the way, prudential transition plans, can have an impact on the way transition plans link to the economy. So I think some of the key results I'm going to run you through very quickly, but again, and similar, I invite you to read the full report once you're on the plane back from COP. But some of the key results here, I think that we wanted to focus on are the fact that prudential transition plans, so embedding transition plans in sectoral regulations, would support the credibility of the transition plans and would allow them to have a full sectoral coverage, and would also allow the transition plans to have a better strategic vision on what's being done by financial institutions. It would also support scientific credibility of targets and overall consistency with European policy targets. I think also what's important to note is all this takes place in a context where there are more and more voluntary engagements and commitments that are being taken by financial institutions, and in a context where transition plans were sometimes debated. So it's important to be able to focus on the impact that transition plans can have in this context. What's also interesting, and what this study also shows, is that having prudential transition plans allows supervisors to better monitor the implementation of the plans, and not just their existence, as it is the case already through disclosure, but also their implementation. And incentivizing banks also so that there's no free rider anymore, and that they all have a level playing field to be implemented, and so that they know that this is something that has to be done, and that they have guidance from supervisors to actually do it. So if by embedding transition plans in the regulations, this will allow supervisors to not only make sure that these transition plans exist, but actually monitor how this is being done, and also give the supervisors a clear mandate to also provide sanctions when these are necessary. I think also the second main impact that transition plans would have, according to the study, is overcoming some of the structural challenges that banks are facing. So there are two structural challenges that have been identified in this study. The first one is for banks to be able to overcome some of their structural bottlenecks, and the second one is more linked to some conflicting objectives that the bank might have between its long-term horizons and its short-term objectives. So on the first one, yet again, transition plans can help solve the problem because, contribute to solving the problem, I would say, by supporting banks to rethink the way they're structured, their governance, their strategy, their KPIs, so that the transition plans can be better implemented. And on the conflict of objectives, what we saw in this study is that transition plans can help banks overcome the different tensions that exist and better embrace dual materiality by integrating environmental materiality into its risk management tools, and also integrating things such as the transition risks and the risks that they face through fossil fuel assets. the last topic that the study covers is the impact of prudential transition plans on the real economy. So the study looked at 3 different sectors. It's not comprehensive there, but I think there are 3 of the main sectors where transition plans could have a role to play in fostering the implementation of financial institutions' actions on the real economy. And the one that I just wanted to show you here and focus on here was real estate, because it represents such a big share of what financial institutions are doing. And so I think what the study showed here is the impact of transitional plans on prudential regulations is potentially huge, because the transition plans will help financial institutions think a bit more deeply about the right indicators that they need to be implementing to push for the right actions, and not just greening their investments greening their portfolios by divesting. The 2 other sectors that the study looked at were fossil fuels and the automotive sector, but there again, I'll invite you to look at the study for more information on that. And just the key takeaways from this study. So I hope you understood that the study recommends the implementation of prudential transition plans, because they would allow for a better articulation of what the EU is doing at national level and what financial institutions are doing. It also allows financial institutions to better link what they're doing with the financing of the transition. It also encourages a broader sectoral coverage and an on-off balance sheet of activities. And I think it more broadly invites supervisors to look more deeply into what financial institutions are doing and to indirectly support them in doing the right thing. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much indeed, Claire, and a big thank you also to the colleagues, to Julie and Anushka, that contributed to the actual research. So I think with some of the pointers here, especially in the last presentation, I think it may have been clear that, and I want to repeat this, that as a European research project tasked with finding ways to improve the EU climate policy mix, we have of course started off with what exists in terms of policy in the EU thus far, and develop recommendations that are also specific in a way to the status quo of legislation on climate policy in the EU and in member states. But we've tried now here, on the one hand, we would like to hear from a more international audience on reflections from other parts of the world. But we're also hoping that there is some use in the thinking on these policy instruments for colleagues and experts from other parts of the world. So, and for getting some initial feedback on this, I want to turn to our 2 experts that have kindly agreed to join us and make time in their busy COP schedules to join this panel this afternoon. I will start with Michael Mehling, who is Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and he's also a professor at Strathclyde Law School. And for full transparency, he's also been and is a dear colleague at Ecologic Institute. In particular, he was the head of Ecologic Institute in the United States. And then we have Andrew Minson. I'm very glad to have you, Andrew, who is Concrete and Sustainable Construction Director at the Global Cement and Concrete Association, GCCA, where indeed he's specifically tasked with identifying and communicating what a path to a net zero future can look like for that industry. And so I'm seeing already some pointers from the presentation that we can pick up on. But I would like to start with you, Michael, or Michael, in an international English language context. So, you have a sense, I think, of, and have analyzed in your own work, policy mixes and different means of enticing and incentivizing a move to, cleaner technology practices and investments in different parts of the world. I don't know, you have have had a strong focus at times on carbon pricing, and this is kind of outside of that, but potentially complementary. How, do these three instruments, what do they look like from your perspective in terms of their potential to be contributing to the transformation?
Thanks, Matthias. And I think it's safe to say that friendship does not yet constitute a conflict of interest. So hopefully we don't have to feel bad disclosing that. So thanks for having me here. And I think I enjoyed very much the three presentations. And I think it's extremely important to think about new approaches, and particularly approaches that can accelerate transformation, not just marginal, optimization, incremental improvements, but real wholesale transformation, given the urgency, given the time frame. And before I start commenting on each of the proposals or sort of potential instruments that were outlined in the presentations, let me just very briefly reflect that after 20, 30 years of a relatively established orthodox economist sort of vision of what optimal policy instruments for decarbonization are, and as you know, carbon pricing ruled supreme in that world. Why would you ever bother with anything that's not the least cost abatement option in the current moment, in the current snapshot in time, and you gradually work your way up sort of the marginal abatement cost curve. That's the way to deal with the main market failure, the negative externality of emissions, and everything else is sort of unnecessarily making things more expensive. And I think even die-hard traditional economists have increasingly started acknowledging, damn, there's a lot of other market failures that we also have to tackle. Positive externalities related to innovation being an important one that merit consideration of other instruments. But there's also other disciplines that bring some of this sort of new thinking into the debate. So transition studies, transition theory, there's even journals now dedicated to that. It's really fascinating to sort of see how different the researchers from a variety of disciplines look at this challenge and really argue, wait a minute, we can't just focus on the low-hanging fruit. We have to get every fruit. When your challenge is full decarbonization, zero emissions within a relatively tight time frame, every fruit on the tree has to be harvested, and now, more or less, or we have to start now, especially with anything that has long lead times, that requires, innovation, learning by doing, scaling up competition, etc., building up supply chains. And so one of the important insights has been, sometimes we just really have to do costly, complex, challenging things in the present and not sort of say, well, net present value, discount factor, let's hold off with those. No, we actually really have to do that. And I think the story of renewables and the cost decline, the innovation, the technology learning curves in renewable energy technology growth and bringing the cost down is a perfect example of that. Economists did not think that German subsidies or European subsidies for renewables were really the right approach at the time. Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and many other places would not have access to very competitive, very low-cost renewables. Not that that solves all challenges. So that brings me to the first thematic area that was presented, namely infrastructure and integrated infrastructure planning. And it's quite interesting. I mean, as we have in the electricity sector specifically, but we all know how important the electricity sector is because decarbonization of many other sectors relies on electrification with zero carbon electricity. We're increasingly coming to a point where it's not the cost of generation technologies that's an obstacle. It's thus not access to finance. It's not the investment challenge. It's not something that a carbon price, for instance, can stimulate. No, it's very different kinds of barriers. In the micro level households, it's principal agent problems. It can be behavioral, irrationality or bounded rationality, as economists like to say. But I'm thinking more broadly in the system level, and indeed, infrastructure is proving to be perhaps the biggest setback, the biggest bottleneck that we're facing. So one thing that I was thinking when I heard that, and I think in the paper that you circulated to us discussants beforehand, you mentioned the idea of ISOs, so independent system operators that do sort of an integrated long-term resource planning process to look at how to balance load growth and generation capacities, congestion and infrastructure and all that. Of course, we have ISOs that are to some extent transnational, certainly cross-jurisdictional in the United States, ISO New England, New York ISO, PJM, California. To my recollection, the Midwestern ISO, MISO, even does cooperate with some Canadian provinces. So it's really not just multiple jurisdictions, but it's actually also international. I think there's probably some interesting lessons there because all those ISOs face the same challenge, that major infrastructure siting and permitting projects are not moving forward. The time to interconnect new wind turbines, new grid scale photovoltaic generation facilities, they're not moving forward because it's just not possible, or they're moving forward with such slow speed. And I'll give you one example. I work at MIT, as you know, and one of the big debates in the last several years has been the Northern Pass project, in which Hydro-Quebec, so a major hydropower developer and generator in the province of Quebec in Canada, just north of New England, has been exploring opportunities to share some of this tremendous firm, and that's very important, firm renewable energy generation capacity with where a lot of the load is in just across the border, like in the Boston sort of metropolitan area. And it makes eminent sense, bidirectionally, Not only could you get access to a huge capacity of very low carbon electricity, but you could also even first, it's firm, so it's dispatchable. You get it when you need it, unlike some other renewable sources. And you can even imagine having, when there's surplus wind, say offshore wind along the New England coast, channeling electricity back across the high voltage direct current lines back to Quebec to pump store some of that energy and make it available when you need it. So it's sort of a poster child case of this would be so useful to accelerate the deep decarbonization of electricity in the whole region. Well, it's not moved forward at all. I mean, for years, there's been different plans. Where should one route it? Through New Hampshire, through Vermont, through Maine. Every single part of the path, there's local resistance, there's environmental NGOs protesting. Hydro-Quebec has offered to invest over $1 billion, including at every sort of step of the way in Maine, schools, hospitals, all kinds of investments to make it more appealed or palatable, more interesting to the local communities. And still, it's been challenged in courts. It's hanging in the Supreme Court of Maine. So that shows how important it is to have these tools. Just, it's not easy. And I think that's where we're getting to, both in Europe and North America, to having debates about permitting reform for siting and permitting of large infrastructure, large generation projects. And this is a very legal question because in your questions to us discussants, you also sort of asked how important is that this is enshrined in law. It's very important because you are starting to redefine the rights of local stakeholders, of citizens, of landowners, of farmers. You're starting to redefine whether eminent domain justifies, and you have certain participation rights, you have certain rights to object against projects, but when they are in the common interest, we may have to overrule those rights. And that's a very sensitive, extremely sensitive topic that has to be done very delicately, but it cannot be done without reforming, changing the law. I won't say quite as much about the two others, especially the last one. I have relatively little to say. On public procurement, Johnny, very nice presentation. You mentioned, of course, that the US is sort of doing a lot in that area. California, as so often, has been pioneering it. I think there's a lot probably to learn, and the process and the methodologies that the Californian, probably EPA, has developed to define what's green, to introduce transparency, to measure sort of life cycle emissions. And as you mentioned, the federal government, as part of its federal sustainability plan, has also expanded it to the national level. And that's $630 billion roughly every year. So it's the largest single purchaser of anything, including basic commodities, including bulk materials like steel, concrete, etc. So potentially really, really very useful. There's a task force, they're developing methodologies on definitions, on how to measure, etc. But again, this requires changes to laws because the laws currently say it has to be done on competitiveness, on price, how much bang for the buck do you get? And there's even international laws like the government procurement agreement that may also have to be revisited, just like, with all the trade and climate stuff, the WTO is suddenly back in the game. Here we may have that kind of international law. So again, very interesting, a lot of potential, but probably, again, also not so easy to fully leverage. And finally, on the financial sector and sort of mandatory sectoral transition plans, I don't have much to say on this one. It's intriguing. It does sort of ring a bell that this seems a little bit like expanding the approach of SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, with responsibility for your whole supply chain emissions, and then limited use of offsets for those residual emissions you can't reduce otherwise. But in this case, it's not supply chains; it's your clients, it's the lenders, not the lenders, but the borrowers. that's, I have to sort of, I would want to see the full picture, the net impacts of that. I think clearly there's already a tremendous evolution of the financial regulatory landscape in the EU underway that potentially could sort of accommodate this proposal. So the whole legal landscape, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the Taxonomy Green Bond Standard, all those things sort of show that there is a lot moving on this in this area. But there's also, as always when there's a major reform underway, you hear sort of about the risks and the concerns. And one concern is, of course, if you expand the responsibility of financial institutions that dramatically to the full, not supply chain, but to all the activities of all your borrowers, how will it affect costs? Because that may introduce risk if there's a liability for that, both for the institutions, but also for the directors or supervisors. That typically will be translated into higher, for instance, capital costs, higher interest costs. So I think we have to understand exactly what would be sort of the positive sides and how could that potentially make access to capital more costly, which in turn could slow down some of these necessary investments in clean infrastructure and technologies. I don't have the answer. I think it's interesting. I'm curious to hear more.
Thank you so much, Michael, for offering your thoughts and on all three. I appreciate the degree to which you indeed are also following what's happening in EU financial regulation. I think I would have points to come back on, but first let's go to Andrew. I'm super interested in sort of hearing what you make of these ideas and how they correspond to the challenges that you identify for your sector, in embarking on the journey to, net zero concrete in the long run. So, do you find some of these helpful in speaking to the challenges that you're facing, and where are they maybe missing, the target?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, and to provide some context for that. Just quickly, the Global Cement and Concrete Association represents the vast majority of production of cement outside China, and we have some key members within China. Wherever you're from, whatever country you're from, there'll be an association for cement and concrete producers within that country, and they are typically aligned with us as a global organization, and our remit is to drive lower carbon production and explain how the material can be used to deliver a sustainable and resilient built environment. So the first question is, given that we emit 7% of global emissions, isn't the solution just to stop producing cement? Well, that would be the easy way, wouldn't it? But actually, we need the product. 4.2 billion tons of cement is used to create even more volume of concrete to deliver the clean water, the housing, the hospitals and schools we need. And there is no substitute that's available at that scale. The reason it's used so much is the material is available. It's cost effective because it's so widely available, and it's versatile in the way it can be used. It can be used to deliver curbstones outside or paving stones. It can be used to deliver the tallest building in the world just down the road from here. And that versatility means that it's so widely used, which is why it ends up delivering 7% of the emissions. And there isn't the stuff available in any other form to replace it. People have tried for many decades. So we need the material. It gives us the challenge of how do we decarbonise. We've got a decarbonisation route map that gives us the technologies. I'll just quickly go through those, but behind those are the policies that we require for those technologies. So I need to sort of just mention some of the technologies. So we've got a whole life roadmap at a global level. You'll be pleased to know that we're also developing those with our partners nationally, those roadmaps, the whole life roadmaps at a national level, because that's where policies are made. And we've got the same language, and I'll come back to that point later on, the same language between the global roadmaps and the national roadmaps, so that they're consistent. So we know that if the Brazilian roadmap says X% by this technology, and the Indian one says Y%, we know that that X and Y is different because of their different circumstances, not because we're using different definitions. So if I just come to some of those levers, it's how the material is used. I'm a structural engineer. It's how structural engineers and architects use the material more efficiently. We all see buildings, we all live in buildings, we all live in infrastructure, and designers design those to various constraints. If the carbon is a constraint rather than cost being the only constraint, designers will deliver you a different building. So if carbon can become a constraint for the design community, in our roadmap by 2050, we'll have 22% less use of the material. That's just because you put carbon as a constraint. And whatever policy instruments you need to have that, we'll come back to that in a second. Now, the concrete production can also do that. Technology within the concrete production process is already available to have about 11% reduction. Then we move into what's within the gate, which within the manufacturing process. We can use alternative materials. We've got waste products from other industries like fly ash from coal-fired power stations, slag from steel production, a new one coming on stream, not a waste material, but calcined clay. Clay is available all around the world. Certain clays can be used to produce a product that can be mixed with cement that overarchingly will give a lower carbon footprint for that cement. And I'll come back to an example in Ghana where policy failure is blocking progress in that regard. Then we move into the efficiency of the thermal efficiency of the kiln. We burn material at about 1400 degrees. That requires a lot of fuel. In Europe, a lot of that fuel is actually waste material, unrecyclable waste material. We've got the right policies in place to enable that to happen. Globally, that percentage is only 6%. There's the same waste globally as there is in Europe. We had the high-level champion for Africa on our stand just 2 days ago, talking about the problem of open burning of waste and the emissions from that, the particulates from that. That waste product could be being used within cement kilns that exist already, so there's no investment in the cement kiln. The kiln already exists. Yes, a bit of investment in the pre-processing, and that material can obviate the import, in some countries, the importation of coal into those countries because you're using a waste material that's otherwise a problem. Within the kiln, it's important to recognize this. Why are we a hard-to-abate sector? Why can't we just be solved like other sectors by decarbonising the grid? It's because there's a chemical reaction that happens within the kiln. You get limestone. Limestone's available all around the world in huge quantities, which is why concrete's used so much. That chemical reaction in the kiln, limestone gets broken down, CO2 is emitted. That's like, you can't turn gravity off. You can't change this chemical reaction from limestone into the clinker which produces the cement. Maybe we can come up with a different chemistry. Well, people have been trying that for decades, and every now and then there's a eureka moment. Many of those eureka moments are based on a magnesium-based chemistry. Brilliant. We've got that in our roadmap to 2050. It will contribute maybe 3, 4, 5% of overall cement demand. The raw materials just are not available in the volume required. If you see in Twitter and LinkedIn, you'll see Eureka solution that's going to solve the world's problems on cement. It might solve 1 or 2%. We haven't got the scale. If we get something at scale, brilliant. We've got 26 years to get it, and it hasn't come in the last 26 years, so we better crack on with what we need to do. So to deal with this CO2 that's been emitted from the limestone, we need carbon capture, utilisation and storage. At the moment, there's no replacement for that. The big change in the last 3 or 4 years would be the understanding of policymakers that this is the reality of the situation. So we are seeing funding and grants at the European level, the IRA Act in the US, great action from the Canadian government, recognising that this sector, which is essential to produce the product that we need for our schools and hospitals, drinking water, sanitation, etc., we need to have carbon capture and storage. The right policies are being put in place to enable that to happen, which is fantastic news. And we'll come back to that in a second. So trying to relay all those 3 things back to the 3 areas we've talked about. We've talked about public procurement. Yes, we want green procurement of our product. That's key within our roadmap as an underlying policy. And that sends a demand signal and provides a green premium to our products. Just while I'm on this, I'll just pick up your point. I think we need all the levers at once. I think absolutely right. So we can't just go for the low-hanging fruit first and then get to the other fruit. So carbon capture and storage will not come on stream big time until after 2030. We've got some plants coming up. Breivik in Norway will be producing in 2024. I mentioned the Canadian have been very supportive. The one in Edmonton will be 2025, 26, and then Indiana will come after that. But big-scale CCUS will not come until 2030, beyond 2030. But that doesn't mean we don't need the policies in place now. It doesn't mean we don't need the infrastructure in place now, or we need to get on with the policies to get the infrastructure in place now. I love your quote, actually, I scribbled it down. We must do the costly, complex in the present. CCUS, is right in the bullseye of that statement. We must do the costly complex in the present to be ready for the future. So that's public procurement, and that links into integrated infrastructure. I mean, if you're in the US, maybe you're big enough, and you're integrated infrastructure for transport and storage of CO2. I mean, all of the presentation on that was to do with a decarbonised grid, but actually integrated infrastructure, the policies for that apply equally to transport and storage of carbon. Absolutely need that. So great to hear it. Do whatever all the thinking that you're doing on decarbonised grid, apply that to transport and storage of carbon as well. Be brilliant. US is probably big enough, although probably integrated with Canada, I suggest. But you'd know more about that than I do. Certainly in Europe, there's got to be integration there. And the transition in the banking, to support, for the banking sector to support the production scale would be brilliant. Remember, procurement is really at the product scale. And whilst it'd be brilliant if product measurement, you mentioned these things, rules for measuring, definitions for low carbon and targets, you sort of use different language. I guess you're on the policy side, I'm on the engineering side, so someone can join those two together. So the rules for measurement, the definitions for low carbon and the targets is what we need for public procurement. But at the production scale, actually sometimes the measurement, the definitions and targets are a bit different. To actually bring those together is tricky. It's tricky because at the product level, we want to be doing scope 1, 2, 3. At the production level, we actually just want to be doing scope 1, which is just what's happening in the factory gate themselves, to drive that in order that we can have completeness of the accounting process. So there's a slight discrete, in the short term, I think there's a separation between those two. In the long term, we can get to collapsing those two to be the same. But I think we need to be wary of completeness at this stage, compromising what we can do on public procurement on product. I haven't gone to that in detail. If people are really interested, we maybe pick that up again. That's probably enough for the moment.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for very concretely applying the potential benefit of these three instruments to your industry. Very concretely, on that last piece, so is not possibly an association, especially at the global level, maybe in a position to work with public authorities or offer to them, the support for the criteria that will help define, what is basically then, low carbon or near zero carbon or zero carbon cement for procurement purposes?
Thank you for that question. I couldn't have written a better question for me, so thank you. So we're working with UNIDO, have got an arm which is IDDI, so Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative. They've got 10 signatory countries on low carbon procurement, and we're working with them on definitions for low carbon and near zero concrete. And the mechanism, and we've got that for cement already, based on the report from the IEA published in May 2022, which got achieving in the title, but you'll get it, IEA May 2022. It's got definitions for low carbon and near zero cement and steel, and we're developing the definitions with IDDI for concrete. Because concrete doesn't travel much because it's heavy, the targets will be based on, will be structured at national level or at sub-national level even. Certainly if you're a country like the US or India or China, you'll be actually doing it at sub-national level. So that's the definitions of what low carbon and near zero are. That's the targets will be set at national level. But actually how are we measuring it? So they published a white paper just this last Tuesday, the IDDI, towards harmonisation of environmental product declaration rules. So environmental product declarations is like, if you're not familiar with that, so nutrition labels on your food, probably not on this can of water. Nutrition labels on your food, a direct analogy to an environmental product declaration on a construction product. It goes through all the different environmental indicators, one of which is global warming potential, and that's obviously the one that's used most frequently. Lots of different indicators, but the rules by which you do that EPD are different in North America as in Europe, and some other systems exist. We need to get harmonisation of those rules so that the EPD that this gentleman might produce and the EPD that you might produce actually are consistent with one another. So if you're procuring from these two producers, you know that eggs are eggs and apples are apples, and you're not mixing up. So we need to get those definitions agreed. Some people will say EPDs are not working. I would stress to them that that wheel might not be perfectly round, but it is pretty good. So please do not try and create something different. The construction sector has worked on environmental product declarations for over 20 years. The wheel might not be perfectly round, but the problems with it in terms of it not being round will be encountered by any new system that you try to create, and you'll spend 15 years to get it as round as it currently is. Let's work with what we've got and improve that. The construction sector is adopting it. It's becoming more mainstream. You mentioned California leading, the West Coast of America leading. So EPDs have become sort of basically industrialized. Tens of thousands of EPDs in concrete products in the West Coast of America because of procurement is demanding that from the supply chain. The supply chain has the ability to produce them. We produce a tool that is available to all our members for nothing and for non-members at cost basis to enable them to produce environmental product declarations, which are absolutely the underpinning requirement for public procurement.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back, but I want to already mention to our audience that, of course, we've been talking much up here. For those that are here in the room, please do signal if you want to come in. We would very happily get questions or comments, additional contributions to the conversations on any of the aspects or any of the policy instruments. So. Feel free to signal. I'm going to sort of start turning more towards you if you want. But with no immediate hand going up, I'm going to do the further probing myself. But do think of something if you want to come in. We also have an extra chair if you want. But I want to ask, so in lieu of our audience immediately joining in, Michael, I was wondering, you obviously you follow what's happening in the US most, sort of it's your main your HQ for work and everything, non-work as well. But you do get around quite a bit and see what's happening in other parts of the world. Are there any of these the kind of barriers that you're speaking to as well, that these instruments, the kind of maybe less immediately seemingly cost-efficient ones, but ultimately potential contributors to an effective policy mix? Are you seeing bits and pieces of those that would also be useful in other parts of the world and under slightly different circumstances maybe than in North America or in Europe?
So first, I want to take your comment about anybody trying to reinvent the EPDs. Any alternative would have probably the same flaws, meet the same challenges, and it would take 15 years to develop. That'll become my standard answer to why we need COP. Because for 20 years we've always heard it's a waste of time, we need something else. Exactly what you just said, it's the same thing. But now to Matthias' question, and humor aside. So absolutely, I hadn't thought about that when I was here sort of scribbling notes, and I was focusing very much on the US, of course. And I think one thing I have learned, I've worked a lot on carbon pricing in many other countries, along with you and Johnny, capacity building, etc. One thing we learned quickly is that policies do have to adapt to a very significant degree to the local context in which they're implemented. And the context will also differ with these kinds of alternative approaches. So my sense would be, it's such a rapidly evolving field that I've been more or less challenged just following what's happening in the EU and in the US, in sustainable finance, for instance, in public procurement, etc. But in developing countries in which often the governance structures are still much less mature, let's say, and the coordination, just the capacities, the resources, the coordination between federal and subnational, for instance, are not as robust and don't have 2-3 centuries of legacy, infrastructure is the wrong word, administrative and legal and regulatory structures to build on. I could imagine the first one being enormously important, especially large countries like India, where I could imagine, coordination between Delhi and all the different Indian states, and then to the municipal level, must be a tremendous challenge. And I'm sure there's discussions and probably task forces and working groups right now discussing how can we in the sustainability space and the decarbonization space streamline that sort of, planning nationally and at the local level. When I'm thinking of public procurement, many countries around the world, of course, have a higher share of, of government intervention, let's put it somewhat ambiguously, state-owned enterprises. So it would seem to me, again, that while we have tremendous procurement budgets in Europe, in North America, etc., relative to the overall economy, to the size of GDP, I would assume that China is probably even bigger, in relative terms, not in absolute terms, maybe. So the impact of ensuring that there, too, public procurement greens and that greening process is accelerated would make eminent sense. Again, I suspect, this is probably not a lever that they have not discovered and are not trying to start to use. But it certainly helps to have more exchange of practices, of experiences, of lessons learned, and to try and get more dialoguing and even events like this going to facilitate that exchange. And finally, on the sustainable finance, again, it's such a complex and such a rapidly developing field that I don't want to go out on a limb there. But I do remember when we were doing projects in China, Matthias, with Benjamin, I remember how there too, the importance of the financial sector, very much recognized by the government as part of as a key part of the whole decarbonization challenge. So imagine they're doing stuff, but then the question becomes, are we all going in different directions? Like with the EPDs, as you mentioned, to what extent can we help harmonize approaches? To what extent is that even possible, given the very different context, the very different sort of political economy, institutional, legal, cultural, etc., conditions or circumstances in each jurisdiction? But, unless you start the conversation, it's not going to happen. And I don't think that on some of the topics that you are pioneering here that we yet have really robust channels.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that look at other parts of the world. I actually want to also check with our expert input speakers. I think Nina is still on the call, but also Claire, you were, for example, presenting your colleagues' work, but you have your own background and expertise, in particular sort of in financing infrastructure and other construction in sort of the, parts outside of Europe, for example. So if you want to come in and share any insights from that to this conversation, please feel free.
Thank you. I don't want to be too disconnected with what's just been said, but I think from our point of view, so we work a lot with public development banks and developing countries. And what we see is that voluntary commitments are important, and it's great to see these, but what's really important is to see how these are being implemented. And from our side, when we look at the net zero commitments that are being taken, often there is a temptation sometimes to divest, to be able to actually reach these engagements and commitments. And what we would tend to support from a more, I'd say, public development mandate, and looking more at how these engagements and commitments can actually contribute to what's happening in the real economy and to what developing countries actually need, is more of Paris alignment discussion. So these are probably terms that you've also heard, so they're the ones that we probably hear more on the public development side. But trying to see how these financial engagements can actually link, and this is where transition plans also come in, but actually link to the national development pathways. And for that, there's a bit of a complex system around that, but what we encourage is for national governments to actually prepare their NDCs and have ambitious NDCs, but then and essentially break them down and translate them into financial plans so that you guys know what the government expects from you, where the economy is going to, and then the financial system can come in and actually finance your activity. So I think that's the overall idea from a more public development perspective there.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would have a follow-up, but I see Andrew is also eager to come in. And so Nina, we have you also, I can see you still. Just signal if you would like to also contribute to the conversation. I will know.
So
so that is a yes. So I'll give it to Andrew first, and then to you, if that's okay.
So just quickly come in there. I mean, it doesn't just apply to our sector, but there are other sectors that are hard to abate. And you're absolutely right. It's not going to help anyone if the banking sector just goes for the easy to decarbonise sectors and forgets about those sectors that society needs, which are hard to abate. And so therefore, that's why our roadmaps are important, I think, in terms of communicating, well, what rate is possible, what does good look like for our sector, so that people aren't not disinvesting in our sector, but are investing in those players within the sector who are doing the right thing.
And actually, yeah, to be kind of extreme on that, I think what you, maybe from to take the cement example, then would be expecting clear signals from the government on where you should be going to, and probably not so much green cement, you actually producing green cement tomorrow, but rather what is the cement going to be used for? And that's what I think ultimately really matters, and that's what ultimately we would really be looking at there.
Thank you. So, and I also, Jonathan, I've also seen you, but we'll give it to Nina first, please.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you very much for Michael and Andrew for the great comments and contributions. I think Michael underscored very explicitly and eloquently how important infrastructure is. And I do agree with Andrew that CCS also, or like the piping and the infrastructure for CCS, also falls on the integrated infrastructure planning. I think the scale of electricity infrastructure and hydrogen is still bigger than CCS, but it's the same idea. And I think what's important to realize here that we've been focused for a long time on getting the generation, the renewable generation, the renewable carriers, solar power, wind power, hydropower, etc., to get those going. And we see in the world, we see the costs declining, we see increasing amounts, and this is very important. But the next step, and the step that's actually not very far ahead of us, but right now, is to adapt the infrastructure that we have now and that we need in the future to those changing types of generation. I think Michael gave a very good example in Boston, in the Canadian-US area on the challenges that infrastructure poses currently on moving forward and getting more renewables into the system. I think I saw, while we're doing this research, I saw one very future-looking idea. It's not a project, I think, but one that said, well, solar generation in the Middle East actually in time aligns very well with the demand on the Indian subcontinent. So connecting these two areas would create a tremendous potential for using solar energy for a big chunk of the demand in India and in the Middle East, where you people are in Dubai. Solar is, you can almost think of it as firm generation. The sun is almost always shining. So I think we really need to think not only about the generation side, but really move forward to a systemic, system-wide approach. And we see that in infrastructure very clearly, and also on the financing and public procurement and the whole, also not physical, but the financial system. So I think I wanted to add that to the very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Indeed, Nina, I think I've also brought back the kind of introductory framing side, which I also wanted to try and show how indeed even the policy instruments that we analyzed separately, could form part of a package in addition to existing policies, if you are indeed taking a more systemic perspective of what the larger picture should look like. Jonathan, you also wanted to come back in.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to pick up on a couple of the points from Andrew, and thanks for providing a really practical understanding of the cement industry. It's quite difficult to get the full picture when you're working at the policy level. But one of these points was the difficulties of measuring emissions of cement and therefore setting environmental product declarations based on the embodied emissions. I understand, this is a challenge, which is why we also try to propose this other approach, which is providing incentives in the award criteria. And I think the Netherlands is actually a good example to point to for this. They lean on the private sector for life cycle costing tools for measuring the emissions of projects. And also, there's another tool called the CO2 Performance Ladder, which assesses companies based on their emissions intensity. And the other point is that you mentioned, there's with public procurement or like with producing low emissions cement, there's like a green premium for these technologies, and this is true. There's a short run extra cost which needs to be paid for purchasing these technologies. But I mean, we did some back of the envelope calculations, and we worked out like the climate benefits of implementing public procurement to a transformative level by 2030. The climate benefits alone would exceed this extra cost of procuring green cement and steel. And it's not like there's not only climate benefits from public procurement of green cement, there's also, lead market creation, so competitiveness advantages, and also the potential for creating jobs. And that's all I'd like to say.
Thank you.
So I just want to confirm, so CO2 ladder in Denmark, all of those effectively are underpinned by EPDs. So EPDs, the wheel is pretty round. It's working, okay? So, and anything that you read on CO2 comparisons, go back to EPDs on that methodology. Otherwise, our two producers, fictitious producers in the room, are going to be producing apples and pears, and we'll be nowhere. So stick at EPDs. I want to just stress that point. And your second point was, just quickly, just remind me.
Just that there are significant benefits.
Yes, so thank you, that's enough for me. So CCUS is the most expensive one. If it doubles the cement cost, that's the powder that goes into concrete, that only increases the concrete by about 30 or 40%. Your new building, actually, the cost of the concrete material in that new building is actually so small that the premium that you got on that whole construction project, that whole asset, is maybe 1 to 3%. So you're absolutely right. The cost to your ultimate client of the most expensive way of getting near zero cement is maybe 1, 2, 3%. If you happen to package your infrastructure asset so it's concrete rich, it might be 5 or 6%. If I was to ask you, sir, if you would be prepared to pay that much for near zero cement in your next asset at only 4 or 5%, you'd bite my hand off. I mean, that is actually amazing. Elsewhere, the green premium to get near zero product is much more than that. So so it means it's possible, but it's expensive at the production end. So we need to have the policy. Come back to your point, we need to be able to do the complex now and have the policies in place to do the complex now, because we need to have that coming on stream.
Thank you very much. I think that also ties in nicely with Nina's suggestion to look, sort of at bigger pictures and systems. The point that Claire made about the question here, so what indeed is the cement going to be used for, in what form? What's the actual demand? So we do have a variety of levers available, and need to be pulling on all of them for it to all work and to be in the end ultimately also affordable in the near term, so that we can manage and sort of keeping up our current livelihoods in the long term. I think with that, I'm going to call this event to a close. I want to very much thank our speakers joining here on the panel, both the input experts and our two panelists, and Nina joining us remotely, and for all of you for joining us here in the room. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a strong and progressive outcome from this COP, so that we indeed have more dynamic and momentum going forward, so that indeed some of these innovative policy tools will also be recognized for their potential in your respective constituencies, and certainly also back home in Europe, where we are going to go back to and try to spread the word. Thank you, and have a very good evening, everybody.